Welcome to You Are Not a Frog, the podcast for GPs, doctors and other professionals in high-stress jobs. Working in today's pressured environment, you may feel like a frog in boiling water. Things have heated up so slowly that you might not have noticed the extra long days becoming the norm. You've got used to feeling constantly busy and often one crisis away from not coping. Let's face it, frogs only have two options: to stay in the pan, be boiled alive, or to hop out and leave. But you are not a frog, and that's where this podcast comes in. You can do more than just hop out or burn out. There are simple changes that you can make which will make a huge difference to your stress levels and help you enjoy life again. I'm your host, Dr. Rachel Morris, GP turned executive coach, speaker, specialist in workplace resilience and creator of the Shapes Toolkit training programme. In the podcast, I'll be chatting with friends, colleagues and experts, all who have an interesting take on this stuff, so that together we can take back control and thrive. If you want more resources, including CPD reflection forms for the podcast, then make sure you've signed up to the You Are Not a Frog Collective, and please share these podcasts with anyone who needs them. On with the episode. So it's really great to have with me on the podcast Beccie D'Cunha. Becky, welcome. Did I pronounce your name right?
You did, Beccie D'Cunha. That's right.
Excellent. Becky, do you want to just introduce yourself? Tell us what's your background and what do you do now?
So at the moment, I help leaders and teams to have courageous conversations. So I run a company called Courageous Companies, and I do a range of things. I mediate to help teams to have courageous conversations they might otherwise avoid. I do training and coaching and facilitation to help leaders and teams to talk about performance or conflict or change, thickness, all kinds of things that they might find it difficult to talk about. And I also do some work around helping people to talk about their strengths and their differences. So one of the tools I use is Lumina, which is a psychometric tool, Lumina Spark. And in terms of my background, I started out as a social justice campaigner, and then I discovered mediation, and it was quite life-changing. And I became a workplace mediator, and then went on to do a few leadership roles in charities and small businesses. And I guess my interest was I saw a lot of organisations doing great stuff in the world, in the public sector and the charity sector in particular, but their culture often didn't live up to that mission. So often staff were unhappy, burnt out, lots of conflict, lots of stress. And I wanted to kind of bridge that, I guess, first as a consultant and then as a leader, to build kind of healthy culture and values in organisations. And that experience, I guess I had a lot of experience of managing through change and crisis and uncertainty. And then putting some of the mediation stuff and consultancy stuff into practice, I guess. And then more recently, I started working for myself. I now bring together that leadership experience with the consultancy experience.
Brilliant. So you say you've had a lot of experience sort of leading people through change and uncertainty and in crisis. So I'm really interested in that for our listeners, because I think in healthcare, there's a lot of change going on at the moment and actually a lot of uncertainty. And as we speak, the coronavirus outbreak is sort of starting to hit, and everyone's incredibly worried and incredibly uncertain about what's going to happen. When you have those conversations about uncertainty, what exactly are people wanting to talk about or needing to talk about?
Do you mean as a leader, what as kind of staff wanting to talk about?
Well, what have you experienced in, when you've been working either in the NHS, I know you've worked in some hospitals, or working in organisations, are the conversations different that the leaders are having different to the sort of staff on the ground? And what is the need for a mediator like you to come in? Why are people finding it difficult?
Well, I guess one of the challenges is that, and I see this a lot in the NHS, I guess, and in hospitals where I've worked, either as a mediator or a trainer or a coach, there's so much pressure now. There's kind of constant or almost a constant state of change that people are in, but there's also huge pressure on resources. So there's a lot of stuff that's gone out the window that would equip people to work well in that situation of change. So learning and development, budgets being axed, for instance. And I guess what goes out the window then is often the reason I need to come in further down the line is that there isn't much time or care put into the process of dealing with change. And in my experience, that's as important or more important often than the outcome. It's something about, the how, not just the what, that people need to be treated with maybe respect and dignity and empathy, while they're going through kind of uncertainty or change, and that often that can kind of go out the window because of time pressures.
So people sort of not communicating, not being empathetic to the people that are experiencing the change just because they're so busy and they almost forget to do it or they can't do it.
Yeah, and I also think people are just so stressed and kind of time poor, and then also probably quite conflict avoidant and anxious around that, anxious around kind of having any conversations about uncertainty and change. And that then means they're not really, they're in avoidance mode, and they're not putting themselves in other people's shoes. They're not taking the time to kind of listen. And I think in terms of your question around kind of, I suppose in terms of how I've approached it as a leader myself and how I would equip other leaders to manage through times that are uncertain or where there's a lot of change, is, for me, there's a few kind of crucial kind of ingredients, I guess. One is like listening and curiosity, and just making lots of space and time for people to voice their concerns and their fears. And it might sound kind of counter to what I was saying before about people being time poor, but in my experience, that means that time is saved in the long run, because if people are heard at that crucial point and they're allowed to kind of express their fears, their anger, their anxieties, their upset, then it's not going to lead to kind of complaints further down the line, or sickness, absence, or more conflict and grievances and things. So listening and curiosity, and then with that empathy, I guess emotional intelligence comes with that. So, and how people are feeling and what they might need. And I can say a bit more about that in a moment, but for me, feelings and needs are crucial. And then there's something about honesty and transparency, and even if it's uncertain times, to just be honest about what is certain and what is uncertain, and give respect to people enough to be honest in that way. But it's tough, because all of those things, I think, take courage. That's what my business is about, I suppose, courageous conversations. It takes a lot of courage to say uncomfortable things, not knowing how people will react, and to hear those reactions takes a lot of courage. There's a vulnerability and a risk involved. But I think it pays off, because it leads to engagement, it leads to empowerment. It means staff will, or others will, kind of help co-create the change, rather than just being kind of passive, being done to.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because the whole thing about being courageous and having those conversations, we don't, because we're so worried about upsetting people. And I think in healthcare as well, we think we need to have the answers. So if we say, look, this is coming up and I'm uncertain, and someone has a really bad reaction and doesn't agree with us, we feel we've got to fix it, or we've got to come to a conclusion. And then so often we don't say anything because we're worried that there is no conclusion or we can't fix it. So are you saying that actually, for most people, it's enough to be heard, even if they get angry and cross? Eventually they'll come around, and you don't have to fix it or solve their problem or say, or get them around to your point of thinking. Just that expression of anger and frustration is almost normal in a change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in my experience, I've been mediating now for nearly 20 years. And so working with some of this really like heightened emotion. And in my experience, when people are experiencing anger, if they've heard a bit of news that they're upset or worried about or angry about, or they're angry, as you say, maybe with the uncertainty, for me, the most important thing is to, I think of it as kind of 3 A's. So to acknowledge the feeling that's being expressed. So you're feeling really angry about this, or you're feeling really frustrated, or you're feeling really worried. Accept it. That, in other words, don't try and change that. Just accept that, and because it's normal. Maybe even say, in this situation, it's completely understandable that you would be feeling that. And then ask. So be curious. Tell me a bit more about what you're feeling, what you need right now. So rather than trying to fix it, work to understand what it is that person actually needs. And I think that even just the acknowledgement of strong feeling, like naming it, noticing and naming it, I think makes a huge difference. And the shoulders kind of go down, just for someone to know that they've been heard, but an empathic kind of deep listening, rather than trying to change that, which I think is what usually people do to kind of avoid it being difficult, kind of try and brush away that uncomfortable emotion. But instead, to hear it, it means the shoulders go down, and then it moves people from that heightened emotional space into a more logical kind of problem solving space. It might take a bit of time, and empathy is not instant necessarily, but it's amazing the power of then that empathy, I think, to move people into a space where they can then think, rather than us having to solve it for them, or the medical professional having to solve it for them, instead to ask that person or that patient, what do you need, or what ideas do you have, what could be done, what can we do about this? And I think usually people have the answers themselves.
Can I just ask,
Yeah.
how do you teach people not to respond in an angry manner themselves? Because I think that's the problem. Your inner chimp comes out when someone else is cross with you, something you've just said, and you have a very angry reaction. One's first natural response is not to be empathetic, is to just go, yes, but, and argue your case. What tips do you have to help people do that then? Be empathetic rather than arguing?
Yeah. So for me, it's about a non-defensive response to criticism. So I think the first thing that we have to do is press pause on our own stuff. And important to say that for me, empathy doesn't mean we have to agree. Something about just working to listen first and understand what the other person's feeling and needing, and to try and stay non-defensive and hold back our own reactions. So we're pressing pause on our own stuff. And for me, the most important technique in this is summarising or reflecting back what we've heard, because that's a way of making sure we do listen and showing that we listen. And I think it's hard to react when we actually work hard to listen to the other person. It starts to bring down our own potentially as well, because we start to connect with the other person. So I'd want to summarise first. So you're saying, and whatever the person said, what they're feeling, what they're needing, anything that's important in what they've said, check we've understood, ask it for more information if we need it. So make sure we've heard first. And then when we've done lots of good listening and we've probably built some trust with the person because we've listened so well, at that point, the next step for me would be to say, is it okay if I respond? And then if there's any points that I could agree with that the person has said, anything I want to kind of take responsibility for or acknowledge or agree with, that's the time to do it. That builds a kind of bridge and shows that we're willing to take on board feedback. And then for me, the final step would be saying where we don't agree. And if there's feedback we need to give to the person, if we need to express our own feelings, frustration, whatever it might be, disappointment, that's the time to do it. But we're doing it from a place of understanding first, where the other person's coming from.
And is that often all at the same time, or could this be a series of meetings where you just listen in one of them and then you come back and, because I guess some people, if they are really angry and they haven't come down from that anger, is there any point in telling them the counter argument and your own thoughts or not?
Well, a couple of things on that. One is I'd say I agree with you. If they're still angry, I think, well, for me, that's an indication that they're probably not feeling heard enough yet. And I'd probably want to just slow it down and say, is there something I'm not hearing? Or is there something I'm missing? Or what would what would kind of reduce your feeling of anger right now? Just because there's probably something that we're not getting that's meaning they're still angry. And then, but if I do agree that sometimes a bit of time and space might be needed. It might be that we need a bit of time and space as well I'd want to check, do you feel like I've heard you? Maybe, and then ask, maybe we could reconvene when we've both had a chance to reflect a little bit and I can come back with a more kind of thoughtful response.
Yeah, so that's giving that time and space for your amygdala reaction to go away and you to start thinking out of your human thinking brain. And it just strikes me, all that you say is just very like the way we're taught to consult, actually, as doctors. So we're taught to listen and then express empathy and then summarise. So it's stuff that we can do anyway, and then just be curious. I guess the where it's different is that when a patient comes to you with an illness, it's very rarely your fault. You haven't given them a broken leg, or so we can depersonalize it. It doesn't feel like it's personal against us. Whereas if you're working in an organisation or a surgery, say where things have got to change, and you've made that decision that things have to change, and they're really cross, often it can get quite personal. How do we get away from feeling that we're being personally attacked? Are there any tips to do that?
So for me, the crucial thing is still around kind of curiosity, because in my experience, the way that I kind of manage myself when I start to either feel personally attacked or start to judge the other person for bad, usually, I make myself kind of slow it down and ask some curious questions, because I know that if I ask enough of those questions, I'll reconnect again and get to what's really going on for that person, because the chances are they might be speaking in a way that's aggressive and is about and feels personal, but actually I try and remind myself that it's an expression of unmet needs. So in that moment, what is it they're feeling and what is it they might be needing? And I suppose an important theory in conflict resolution, which is a couple of things. One is that feelings and emotions are a really important messenger in that they point to our unmet needs in that moment, and that needs it's really crucial to kind of understand our needs or each other's needs, because those needs are a route to resolution and to well-being, job satisfaction, etc., happy life. But often people act out of when needs are not being met. So it could be that if somebody's feeling angry because they have a need for maybe honesty or autonomy or respect or something like that, and they think in that moment they're not getting that. In that moment they're going to often act in a way it might feel quite kind of unreasonable, but it's all about trying to get their needs met, even if they don't know that's what they're doing. So I try and get it back to kind of what might they be needing. And then in that moment, I suppose, if it's feeling like a personal attack, I think it's also important to just recognise that we have feelings and needs as well, and what might we be feeling in that moment, and then try to bring some emotional intelligence to that moment. And that takes kind of, I think, a lot of practice and intentionality after a difficult situation with a patient, doing a bit of reflection and thinking, what was going on for them? What was going on for me? What was I feeling? Why? What was I needing? And then next time we might be a bit more aware of it in the moment and more able to kind of take a deep breath and try to pause before we react.
So one thing that I really struggle with, and I know Jane Gunn talks about this a lot, is delaying the conversations that need to be had. And I think often when I'm in the conversation, it's fine, but I don't bring stuff up and I just sweep it under the carpet, or I ignore it because I genuinely don't know how to bring it up sometimes. What do you teach in terms of being courageous about how to even start to have these conversations? Are there any tips or things that you would say to go up and say to someone? Or I know it must be, it's obviously different in every context, but what's worked?
So it sounds like there's a couple of things there. There's a question around kind of how to kind of get ourselves to muster the courage to have the conversation in the first place, but then there's how to start it.
Yeah.
Or how to initiate the conversation. The first thing around mustering up the courage, I think some of it is working out our emotions around it. And what are we worried about? What is it that's stopping us from having the conversation? I also think there's something about the doing a bit of logical thinking around analysis around it, and thinking, sometimes I think it's about working out kind of what are the best and worst case scenarios. So if you don't have the conversation, what's the best case scenario and the worst case scenario, and then what's most likely? If you do have the conversation, what's the best and worst case scenario and what's most likely? And then and even writing that down or talking it through with somebody to work out which is the best route. And I do, however, think it's also useful to think in terms of the kind of courageous bit. I often encourage people to notice where they're resisting something and then to do it, to move towards that, like move towards the thing they're resisting. Because I think usually the stuff we resist is the most important stuff. And it's weighing up. I think you talked a little bit about this with Jane in the recent podcast, that it's making a kind of judgment call around how important is the relationship and how important is the issue. If both of them are important, then it's something that probably needs to be discussed. If it's an important issue and that the relationship isn't important, it might be that there's something else you can do rather than having that courageous conversation. But yeah, move towards the things we resist, I'd say. And then in terms of how to start the conversation, I think a couple of things. I suppose one is I'd want to be quite kind of upfront at the beginning and say to the person, there's something difficult I want to talk to you about. And name if it is uncomfortable for you as well. Say, I might want to say, if it was me having the conversation, I'm feeling a bit uneasy about it and I appreciate you might be as well. And then so kind of getting that out there, that it's going to be a bit difficult, and then naming your intention and just explaining what your intention is in having the conversation. It might be, the reason I want to do this, even though it's difficult, is that I really value our relationship and I don't want this to get in the way of it. Or I really want to nip things in the bud early because I don't want things to escalate. Whatever it is, just name that it's coming from a good place. And then the final thing I suppose I'd say in terms of initiating the conversation is, for me, it's important to check with the person that it's a good time and place to do it, and to give them a chance to say, actually, it's not. I've got a lot of things on my mind right now, or I'm about to run off to another meeting. So could we reschedule it? So long as it's not a kind of endless avoidance tactic, give them a bit of choice in when and where you have the conversation.
Yeah, that's a tricky one, isn't it? Because I guess you don't want to catch someone right at the end of surgery because they've got loads of stuff and visits to do. But then you don't want to say, there's something I need to talk to you about. It's really awkward. And, I really value our relationships. I need to talk to you about. And they're like, well, what is it? What is it you need to tell me?
Yeah.
So it's even when you bring it up, let alone have the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's going to probably be a bit of a shock and a surprise in a way. However you do it, there's going to be that moment of and then a little moment of dread in the other person, and then a lot of people wouldn't want to wait in suspense. They'll want to just know what it is. But then I'd see it as the start of a conversation, and say the bit that needs to be said right then, and then come back to it if you need to when there's more time. I mean, the only other thing I didn't say, but that I think is really important, is preparation. I think doing reflection beforehand, both for what I often teach people in nonviolent communication as a good tool to think through kind of what happened, what was the behaviour that was difficult, but to do that as objectively as possible. So it's not you're taking out any evaluation and making it something that anyone would agree to, anyone that kind of observed it or saw it would agree. So really objective observation. And then the impact on you, so what you're feeling or what you felt as a result. The third thing is what you need, thinking about human needs, psychological needs. And then the fourth thing is any requests for the future, like what you'd like to be different. And it's important that that's something that people can do ideally rather than not do, something that's kind of they can say, hopefully they can say yes to. So just even if you wouldn't use that model, just preparing in that way can be useful. And then I'd always try and do it for the other person. So just to think through what might, particularly the feelings and needs, what might theirs be? Because you can then go into it kind of with openness and empathy.
Often when I find myself sort of giving some difficult feedback or saying something to someone, I then find myself going, but it doesn't really matter. No, don't worry. I mean, it's completely understandable. And almost having this sort of fawning response that Ebony Allard was talking about, the fight, flight or fawn, which I'd never really heard of before. But I don't know whether that's a particularly English thing that will bring something up and they go, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's nothing really. And it didn't really upset me and just thought I'd mention it type thing and just really minimising it. Have you seen that happen before?
Yeah. I see that a lot, and I see avoidance happen a lot, and then I see that happen a lot. That fawning, I describe it as, I don't know if you've come across the conflict management styles. There are 5 different conflict management styles.
Oh, right. No, I haven't.
Ron Craybill Style Matters is a good kind of place for people to go if they're interested. You can do kind of quite a short questionnaire, which is really useful beginning. I mean, it's just kind of indicative, but there are 5 styles in conflict. So there's avoidance, harmonizing or accommodating, which is what I think you're describing with the fawning. There's compromising, directing, and then collaborating. And for me, the key in courageous conversations is to try to move to a collaborative space, which is about win-win. It's about looking after the relationship and staying assertive, getting your own goals and needs met. So the fawning is an interesting one, because I guess when we accommodate, and I think a lot of people will relate to that, fawning or accommodating in conflict, it's often because we care about the other person, and it's important to reflect on that. I think, why is it we've gone into that mode? And it's probably that it could be that we just don't want the fallout. We want to go back into avoidance mode. We want it to go away. It could be that we just have a really strong need for harmony in relationships and we get flustered when people are upset. It's probably that we care about the person and we want to please them. We want them to be happy and not upset. So I think it's something about, again, it comes with, I think, understanding our style, working out what triggers that shift. Why do we go into that mode? If we were having the conversation, the example you gave, where you start to have a conversation and then you hear someone's response and then you start to say, anyway, it doesn't matter, it's completely fine. What's triggered that shift and what's behind it? Is it because we've heard a bit of emotion in the other person and we're wanting to shut that down? And what's that about? Is it because we've started to doubt ourselves and think maybe this isn't important after all? Is it that it's our own self-esteem that's kind of wobbling? So getting to that kind of why. And then for me, it's about, I guess, practicing collaborating, but in as safe spaces as we can. So in the Ron Crabill's stuff around Style Matters, he talks about calm and storm conditions. So calm, when there's the early stages of a conflict, we might try and have a conversation when things are quite kind of lower stakes. And then the shift to storm conditions, when the stakes are a bit higher, there's more emotion, it's escalated. And if we can practice collaborating in the calm conditions, I think it will better equip us for the scary conditions where it's more stormy. And it's about how can we stay assertive, and it takes practice, I think, and self-awareness, like how can we hold fast to what we thought and care about, even when we're wanting to fawn or accommodate.
And does it work? Have you seen people that have been in massive conflict against each other, massively hurt by each other, managed to find a common ground and managed to get through it and build that relationship back?
Yeah, all the time, like on a weekly basis, I see it. And because for me, there's so often, I think, it comes about, conflict gets to that point because, and it's escalated, partly because of avoidance. And so things have become bigger in people's minds. And also because I guess where it's not dealt with, where the conversation hasn't happened in a timely way, there's layers upon layers that are put on top of those, what actually happens. So it's often layers of interpretation. We often assume intent where it wasn't there. So a lot of my work, I guess, is about helping people, when I'm mediating, is helping people to separate out the intention, because it probably wasn't the person probably didn't intend harm, but the intention from the impact, because the impact is probably very real. Help people to acknowledge the impact on each other, but also acknowledge where it wasn't intentional. Yeah. But yeah, definitely. For me, all of these tools are really quite transformative, because even in a lot of my work, I might go into a team where there's so much mistrust they can't even look at each other, or it's hard to come in a team in a room together. Or it could be two individuals where there's been a complaint. And for me, these tools kind of just rehumanize people. They help them to reconnect. There's also something about process again and I think of it in terms of, I think it's really useful in terms of thinking about patient complaints as well, that even if somebody has a kind of a really serious and maybe legitimate complaint, or maybe it's not, maybe it's that their complaint is unfounded, that the process of how that complaint is heard and dealt with will often lead to the person being willing to put the complaint aside, even if they don't agree with the outcome. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. We all know that, if complaints handled badly, they escalate, don't they? But it just, and I think we're so frightened of having these conversations that we leave them. And then what happens is grievances get put in and big complaints, and that's never good. It's much better just to sit down. I absolutely love what you just said, that we need to separate intention from impact. Because very rarely people do things with the sole reason to piss you off. I mean, that doesn't, someone might have dumped a visit on you, and which made you late and made you miss the important dinner that you had planned. That wasn't their intention, was to cause you grief and to make you miss something. Probably their intention was to lighten their own load, and they were worried about saying, or whatever, but we so often assume the wrong intention. So do you tell people that they should just go and check the intention out, or is that a bit too threatening?
Yeah, well, I guess I try and help them to, usually I'd maybe ask them questions that would help them to think about what might the other person's intent have been, and to kind of open up the possibilities. So it might be that I might say, okay, so you've said that you think it was deliberate. You think they did this deliberately to kind of cause you upset or irritation or pain or whatever, inconvenience. What, if any, are the other possibilities? What if it was something else? What might that have been? And then what would that be like if that wasn't their intent? What would that be like? If that was intent, what would that be like as well? Recognizing that's possible. And then if it's the two people having but then, yeah, absolutely. It's then about kind of asking them, how can you find out? What will enable you to check this, to check what you've kind of assumed with them around their intentions? And if I was facilitating that, often those are the moments of real breakthrough and understanding and relief, where somebody describes what they thought the person had intended. And I have to ask quite difficult questions in there. Like sometimes it's just asking directly, why do you think they did that? Can you name it? What's your worst fear? And then they answer that, and then I give the other person a chance to respond and say, did you know that? Was that what was going on for you? What were you intending? But in all of that, it's still really important that the other person has heard the impact and hopefully heard it and empathized with it, because even if they didn't intend it, the person will probably still need to have that empathy.
Absolutely. I can imagine that you would be horrified if you heard what other people thought you had intended by your actions. But often we minimize what we think the impact of our actions actually are. So it's just getting that awareness, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Sometimes it's about personality style and working style, because I find quite often where I'm coming into a team that's in conflict and maybe facilitating or doing team rebuilding or something, quite often there can be a lot of conflict, for instance, caused by those that are, if there's some that are more extrovert in the team and some that are more introverted. And it might be that those that I had a recent case that was quite interesting, where for a long time, there was this dynamic where you had a few quite talkative people in the team who, as extroverts often like to, they wanted to talk stuff through, kind of vocalize stuff that's, to help their own thought processes. And they weren't really thinking about the impact on those that were maybe more introverted. And those extroverts were worried or assuming that those that were more introverted were unhappy when they weren't. So they'd ask, how are you? And the introverts might say, I'm fine. And they'd assume from that there's a lot more going on that they're not telling me. And then you had the introverts who were getting annoyed about the noise and not able to concentrate, but they were also worried because they knew that they were being kind of maybe judged for not being so demonstrative and not talking about their feelings so much. But it wasn't that they were holding stuff back. They just, if they say they're fine, it's just because that's all they want to say at that point. So sometimes it's just about getting people to talk about those differences, and there'll be moments where there's just relief that, I didn't realize that's what it is.
Yeah. That's so key. I've seen that with teams where, well, if we describe it in Myers-Briggs terms, I know some people know Myers-Briggs, if you have a J preference, so you like structure, you like to know where you're going, you like to know the steps that you're going, and then you've got someone else who sort of knows where they're going, and we'll go round about houses. We'll get there, but often last minute and whatever. That's really stressful for someone that likes to know. And they're like, you're not taking this project seriously. I can't rely on you because I'm not getting stuff to the last minute. And the other person's going, well, why are they being so ridiculously anal about this? This is just crazy. So I think you're absolutely right. A lot of conflicts is just our different preferences, but it's very difficult to see when you have I have quite a high intuitive preference, so I like to think about big picture and stuff like that. And sometimes in meetings, when someone just goes straight to the detail and well, how's that going to work? I can't, and criticizes detail, it drives me up the wall. And I think, why can't they just go with the ideas and let's brainstorm and do this? And they're going, oh well, that's not going to work because at 3 p.m. on a Friday we do this and blah blah blah. It's like actually, we need people like that. We need people like me. We need people who are very good at the detail, because that's the way teams function much, much better. But it causes conflict, and we assume the other person's just being difficult or annoying, probably to annoy me. But actually, nothing of the sort.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're spot on that both the JP in Myers-Briggs terms and the NS are kind of real causes of conflict in organisations. And definitely we kind of assign intent to a lot of that stuff as well, and think, because it's hard to see outside of our own kind of experience, isn't it, and our own kind of preferences. And I guess for me, the challenge is I think a lot of people in a lot of organisations they might do a psychometric or something like Myers-Briggs, and they're aware of their differences, but they haven't kind of moved beyond that awareness to empathy and adaptability.
Yeah.
And to have, again, courageous conversations around, in those meetings, what is it that bugs you, and what would you like to be different, and what could you do to support others that are different to you? So kind of really getting people to empathize and then be willing to adapt.
Yeah, and wouldn't it be great if we could all have those conversations in the calm phase before it gets to the storm phase, before we've avoided it we've been working with that person for 5 years and they've peed us off since we started. Actually, if we'd have just had a conversation at the beginning about, that's an interesting approach to your work, it might have been better. Okay, so Becky, we're sort of running out of time, but what would you say to someone who knows they need to have a courageous conversation with someone because they've been working for them a while and lots of things have happened that maybe been swept under the carpet, but making them a bit miserable? What 3 top tips would you give them for doing this?
Okay, so 3 tips on how to have that courageous conversation. I think the first thing for me would be to do some preparation beforehand and think about, what are you wanting to get out of this conversation? It's almost doing some pros and cons and thinking about the costs of the conversation, but the costs of not having it as well. And to think about what your feelings and needs are in the relationship and around this issue, and then to do a bit of reflection on what the other person's feelings and needs are as well. So you go in kind of ready to have an open but empathic conversation, good preparation. And then for me, the second thing is around being honest and vulnerable. And there's a risk in vulnerability and honesty, but to be willing to actually share that, to talk honestly about the impact on you, your feelings and your needs. That's going to be crucial to build a connection with the other person, so the other person actually cares enough to want to do something about it. If we can have a conversation on that level, rather than just chucking blaming statements back and forwards, we're going to go a lot further. So honesty and vulnerability. And then for me, the third thing is around probably blocking two things together, but it's listening and empathy. It's being willing to, after we've shared what we want to share, be willing to be challenged on it, to give the other person space to respond, to say what their interpretation was, and working hard to listen out for how they're feeling as well.
Great advice. Thank you so much, Becky. So Becky, if people wanted to get hold of you, how can they do that?
So I've got a website, which is courageous.co. So it's Courageous Companies, but courageous.co. Or they can look me up on LinkedIn, follow me or connect with me on LinkedIn. It's Beccie D'Cunha. It's hard to spell both my names, but I guess they can get that on your...
I'll put it all in the show notes, yeah.
Or they can email me. People can get on my mailing list if they're interested in that. But it's Becky, Beccie @courageous.co.
Brilliant. Okay. Thank you so much. Put all of those in the show notes. And Becky, I'd love to have you back another time. I'm quite interested in these personality differences and, how we can assess that and how we can work better with people who do have a different personality profile from us. So will you come back on the podcast another time?
Yeah, I'd love to. That would be brilliant.
Thank you so much. Have a great day. Goodbye.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please share it with your friends and colleagues. Please subscribe to my You Are Not a Frog email list and subscribe to the podcast. And if you have enjoyed it, then please leave me a rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. So keep well, everyone. You're doing a great job. You got this.